think this is also the kind of like stupidity that you see among an extremely arrogant empire that feels entitled and superior, even though it hasn't won a war. I mean, when's the last time the US won a war? It loses everywhere it goes in so many ways. We could do a whole hours long podcast just on how the US has lost one war after another over the last several decades. So I think this is like an empire that's stuck and that isn't sure which way to go, and that's also belligerent and extremely violent and is willing to like, okay, like if we go down, we take everyone down with us. And I think that's what's scary about the US right now.
Hello and welcome to the No Cold War Britain podcast. My name is Fiona Edwards and my co-host is Ileana Chan. This podcast aims to bring you in-depth discussions every month on the key issue of our time, which is stopping the US's new Cold War offensive and Britain's role in this major threat to world peace and prosperity. Every month, we're bringing you a key voice from either Britain or internationally to delve deeper into why this new Cold War is happening, what dangers it presents, and how can we build a movement to stop it. And today, we're really honoured that joining the show is Rania Khalek, the one and only. Rania is a really prominent Lebanese American writer, political activist, and journalist at Breakthrough News. She's a very powerful voice internationally against war and imperialism, and she's been doing phenomenal work over the last few months in opposing and exposing the US-backed Israeli genocidal offensive against Gaza, which is ongoing. Rania, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and that was a really nice intro. I appreciate that.
Welcome. Rania, as Fiona said, you're a host and producer at Breakthrough News, an important independent media platform. You consistently interview a diverse range of people from global movements for social justice that are often missing from the mainstream Western media. These include voices from India, the Congo, Palestine, China, and beyond. I mean, obviously, you know this, but just for our audience. Flowing from all of these global interactions, what is your assessment on the development of a multipolar world, particularly in light of the fact that over the past few months of the US-Israel attack on Gaza, the United States has become increasingly isolated? Is this a tipping point?
I absolutely believe this to be a major tipping point. I think the world will never be the same after October 7th. And, you know, you mentioned the interview program I do, and I get to talk to experts and academics and just, you know, average people, really smart people from all around the world. And, you know, with a particular focus on people in global South countries, who often talk about a multipolar world, a rising multipolar world. And I think that, you know, we've seen signs of what that means for sort of waning US power in a way in the last few years. But October 7th, I think, was significant in this context in a few ways. When we talk about a rising multipolar world, we're talking about the rise really of China, right? I mean, technically is still a developing country, but what was an extremely poor country because of, you know, imperialism, that really, like after its own revolution, managed to make huge strides in all kinds of social development indexes. And basically, like at this point, its economy has grown so big, it's managed to develop outside of the horrible, rotten neoliberal paradigm that the US has imposed forcefully on so much of the world, that it acts as this kind of alternative for a lot of countries, especially in the global South, especially like post-colonial countries, to look to as an example of what could be done, you know, operating outside of the sort of imperial context of the US. And that has scared the US, that China acting as this alternative, as the possibilities of what you can do with a kind of socialism and sort of sovereignty and your ability to make decisions independently of the interests of the US that, again, are often forcefully imposed on all these countries around the world, whether economically or militarily or sometimes both. And I think that there's been a very major concern among the Western countries, among elites in Europe and in Washington about the rise of China. A lot of that, you know, a lot of what comes with that is a lot of racism and a fear of the global South. And so on October 7th, you have the situation where people in Gaza broke out of their cage. I mean, they've been trapped in this concentration camp for almost 15 years, not to mention, the 75 years of occupation that Palestinians in Gaza and across Palestine have lived under for decades and decades. But Gaza, I mean, it's the worst of it, right? It's people literally living in this closed off ghetto from, under siege from air, land, and sea by the most powerful interests in the world. And they broke out of their cage and they exacted this humiliating, this act of military humiliation on this arm of American imperialism in the Middle East. I mean, Israel's the spearhead of American imperialism in the Middle East. Essentially, it was like the jungle people, as Joseph Burrell would call them, hitting back at the garden. And so in this moment that I described of, a lot of anxiety among these imperial countries about the rise of China and what that means for the potential independence of so many countries across the global South who have their resources stolen and the lives of people shortened as a result of imperialism. In the context of anxieties about the ongoing ability of the U.S. to control the world that way, you have, Palestinians rising up and breaking out of their cage and making Israel look really bad. And, that can't be tolerated. And so in response, the US and the Europeans have backed Israel, have armed Israel to punish Gaza. And I don't think it's just about punishing Gaza and committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. I think it really is about, I really think it's about, teaching a lesson to the rest of the global South. Like, if you dare to stand up to us, we will destroy and crush you. But in the process, they've ruined Israel's image, I think, internationally in irreparable ways. And I think the US can never go back to that sort of, rules-based order that existed post-World War II, where they use human rights to control so much of the world and use human rights as a weapon against American adversaries. So that's, I mean, I don't know if, I could go on and on rambling about that, but I think overall that's the general way that I look at what's taking place right now in terms of the isolation of the US. And I think what we're going to see as a result is the rise of a multipolar world. The acceleration of that, it's going to become I guess it's going to accelerate even more.
Absolutely. I mean, one of these key sort of features of multipolarity and the global shifts is that the global South is becoming a lot more assertive on the global stage. And like the situation we were talking about in Gaza, obviously this continues to dominate the world situation today. Like every single day, for over 100 days now, Israel has been carrying out crimes against humanity. And in a really historic move, South Africa has taken a case of genocide against Israel to the International Court of Justice. And this case has actually been supported by many countries in the global South, from Asia to Latin America. And I just wondered if you could explain the significance of this and what impact this is having internationally.
I mean, wow, there's so many angles to the significance of this. I mean, even if Israel wins, and I win, I just mean like technically, even if South Africa's case doesn't go forward, but there's a very good chance at least it might, in terms of like looking into whether this is, constitutes war crimes and genocide or not. Just the fact that South Africa brought this case before the International Court of Justice in the first place is huge, because it forced the world to pay attention and listen to the horrors that have been inflicted on Palestinians. I mean, not just now, although they did a really good job of explaining what's happening now. The South African legal team also went pretty deep into, the entire history of how Gaza got to where it was, including the original sin of Israel's creation, the ethnic cleansing of 1948, the ethnic cleansing in 1967, the ongoing ethnic cleansing and displacement at the heart of the ideology that drives Israel's settler colonial project. And that alone was huge. And then, to have South Africa be the country to do it, this country that defeated apartheid, that defeated settler colonialism, is also huge, because, who understands better what Palestinians are going through than, people who went through something similar themselves. And of course, this is a country in the global South. It's a country on the continent of Africa, which, Africa has been the victim of so many horrific acts of genocide and literally people theft and colonialism. All of the worst has happened to Africa. So I think that, and then of course you mentioned, a lot of countries across the global South have said that they support South Africa's case. And I think that when you look at the countries that support versus the countries that have already come out and said that they will, you know, they will intervene legally to help defeat South Africa. And by this, by that, I'm talking about the country of Germany, which came out and said they want to legally intervene to help Israel against South Africa. I mean, you just see it's literally global North versus global South. I don't think it's ever been more clear than right now. And I think this case really brought that to the fore. And I thought it was so funny when Germany announced that they were going to legally intervene to help Israel, because then you had the presidency in Namibia release this statement that was just like a huge smack across the face to Germany, saying, excuse me, you still haven't done anything to make up for the genocide you committed in Namibia, which actually was kind of like the original German genocide before the Holocaust that nobody knows about, that where none of us are taught about. Everybody's taught about the Holocaust in the context of, Nazis being bad. We're never taught about where they got a lot of those ideas. And that's literally what they were doing to the global South in places like Namibia. Not to mention getting ideas from U.S. settler colonialism against Native Americans. I mean, these are things that you already know. I'm preaching to the choir here. But the point is, I ultimately think the significance of this case at the International Court of Justice, even if South Africa doesn't manage to win, the damage has already been done to Israel. And it's just really extraordinary to see this really like imperialist versus the rest of the world situation emerge.
Yeah, and there've also been reports that a team of South African lawyers are preparing a lawsuit against the US and British governments on the grounds that they are complicit in Israel's war crimes in Palestine. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, again, incredible, extraordinary, and it's another extension of this emerging trend of global North, imperialist global North versus colonized global South, where you have the global South asserting itself against the most powerful, violent, I guess, people in the world. That is the people who run the U.S. and its clients, like the people that sit in the British government. And I mean, it's so obvious this is just Israel's genocide, right? Like Israel could not commit its genocide in Gaza. It couldn't carry out its occupation without the constant weapons flow from the United States of America and constant support from the British government, which is responsible for the existence of Israel in the first place in so many ways. And so, I mean, you have Joe Biden. Everybody kind of thinks Joe Biden is this, old, this elderly man suffering from dementia who's just like not with it and not there. But I think he's very much there. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's repeatedly emphasized that he's a Zionist, that he supports Israel to the end. He spent his entire career supporting every single American war you can think of. He spent his entire career being, steadfastly the biggest, most enthusiastic leader of American empire. This is his genocide. And so is, the responsibility belongs to everybody else in his administration as well. And so I love that South Africa is taking this beyond just Israel, because at the end of the day, Israel is just the spearhead of these European countries. It's a European settler project in the Middle East. It exists there to control the Middle East for the global North, for the imperialist global North. So it only makes sense to take this case to the people who are actually responsible for all the horrors we're witnessing.
Just wondered actually, Rania, if we could develop that topic a little bit that you've mentioned about how it's the US that's really responsible for what's going on. Because I think this is actually a bit of a debate internationally within the anti-war movement. I mean, one of the key things that the No Cold War platform likes to emphasize is just how dependent Israel is on the West, particularly the United States, in waging this murderous war on Gaza. And I just wondered if you could explain for our listeners what exactly is the level of US involvement in this war, and give a bit of insight into the history of US imperialism support for Israel. And I think you've already mentioned British imperialism support. And why is the US doing this today? Why are they doubling down on supporting a genocidal offensive in Gaza?
Well, let me take it more general before I kind of zoom in. I mean, what is the U.S. interest in the Middle East, right? The U.S. needs to, you can look at every U.S. Pentagon paper, it's national security paper every year, and it always says the same thing. I mean, the number one interest of the U.S. is to maintain hegemony over every part of the world, especially resource-rich areas in the world. The Middle East is historically and still a huge source of oil, which makes the world run. And we know that the US has overthrown many governments in order to control not just access to oil, but to make sure they can essentially steal it and get it practically for free, to control the oil market and to make sure that oil continues to be sold and traded in dollars, because you have to maintain US dollar hegemony so the US can be the, biggest economy, most important economy in the world. And so in order to carry that out, much like it does in many other parts of the world, whether we're talking about Latin America or Africa or Asia, I guess in the Middle East, I should be saying it's West Asia. But the point is, one of the primary purposes of US control over the Middle East is that oil, and any country that exists there basically needs to be subservient first and foremost to US hegemony. And Israel's role in the region is to basically act as America's police. What are America's threats in the Middle East? Any country that tries to act independently of US interest. Iran is the main country doing that right now, right? So Israel's Iran's biggest enemy. Is that like a coincidence? Is that an accident? No, Israel's there to police Iran for America. And historically, that's been the case as well across the Middle East. Israel invades and occupies its neighbors to destroy any movement that acts independently of U.S. interest, that acts to put the interests of their own people before anybody else. It's why countries like, in the past, Egypt, before Egypt was, turned into like a U.S. client state, Egypt had, was like the center of Pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism. And the U.S. definitely led a number of destabilization campaigns, and Israel played a role in doing that at one point, several times, going to war with the Egyptians. That doesn't happen anymore because ultimately Egypt was pressured, and people were put in charge of Egypt with U.S. help to normalize with Israel. And now Egypt is a country that participates in U.S. imperialism, and its people have suffered tremendously for that. The same can be said about a country like Jordan. Iraq destroying Iraq. I'm not going to sit here and pretend Saddam Hussein was great. He was horrible. And originally, he was an asset of the U.S. until he wasn't. And once he wasn't, it was time for him to go. And Israel played a role in that too. It's like you could go on and on and on. Israel acts as America's police in the region. It acts to maintain U.S. hegemony over the Middle East, to secure access to resources. And at this point, you could even make the argument, and there's people who can make it much better than I do, that it's not just oil that we're after in the Middle East. It's actually a place where we make money off of war. Like there's a huge industry around constant war to make sure this region can never develop on its own. It can never prosper. It can never advance. And so that all these military contractors can keep making money. So there's, there's an aspect to it that where war kind of becomes the resource as well. I'm not going to get too much into that because it becomes a bit of a too much philosophical sounding debate, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. But at the end of the day, Israel could not function or exist without the U.S. making sure countries surrounding it are friends with it. You think these countries normalize with Israel because they like Israel? No. It's because it behooves their ruling classes who've been bought and co-opted by the U.S. to normalize with Israel for business interests. So the U.S. cajoles these countries around Israel to normalize, gives them things for it. Anybody who doesn't normalize with Israel gets sanctioned, gets punished. On top of that, the U.S. gives Israel $3.8 billion a year, by default, in military aid. And of course, a lot of that money, by the way, is just to buy American military equipment. But Israel has its own military industrial complex, largely dependent on U.S. pumping financial support into it. Not only that, even now during this war, Israel, who's Israel fighting? It's fighting people who have been caged in Gaza for 15 years, who use oftentimes homemade weapons. And you see the videos that the Hamas's military wing is putting out, I'm sure. They're not exactly dressed in the nicest clothes and the nicest body armor the way the Israelis are. They don't have tanks. They're wearing sandals and using homemade rockets. So Israel can't fight even people who are using homemade rockets without the U.S. literally pumping constant, this weapons flow is constant. It's tens of thousands of bombs every week, thousands every day. This war would end in 2 or 3 days probably, because Israel would run out of weapons if the US stopped the weapons flow. That is not a country that can function on its own. If it weren't for the US, Israel would fall in a week because it's like outnumbered in terms of, the various groups that are fighting it in the region. And also it's a bunch of settlers who don't have the same attachment to the land that the indigenous people around them do. And they give up a lot more easily, and they're not good at combat either. All that being said, I mean, Israel is absolutely an arm of American empire. It's not, if people feel like sometimes it's Israel calling the shots because they have this huge lobbying apparatus, I think that can be attributed more to the fact that Israel's run by what you could essentially say is like a version or of the Republican Party. And right now in the U.S., Democrats are in charge. So if there's sometimes like a little bit of tension between what the Israelis want to do, which is versus what the Americans want to do, it has more to do with just like a little bit of a disagreement among the ruling class than it does with Israel telling America what to do. And, if Republicans were in charge right now, they would be lockstep with whatever Netanyahu in the Likud party wanted to do, just slightly more than Biden's been.
Yeah, thank you for putting that in context with the region and sort of the history of this constant policing. What do you think about, well, basically I'm thinking about this sort of narrative right now that World War III is coming, there's an escalation, regionally, etc. But so what's the difference? I mean, in your opinion, is there a difference in this moment, with the recent airstrikes on Yemen, and the Houthis and everything like that? Like, what do you, okay, so I guess this is a two-part question. One,
Yeah.
because we are an anti-war, no Cold War Britain, we are anti-war. So I guess my question is, one, is there a difference in this moment with the discussion about this escalation towards World War III, especially from that region? And two, what do we need to know as like an anti-war movement about the situation?
So I think it's important to understand when we talk about, people say World War III. I think it would take a bit to get to that. I think what we're more concerned about here is regional war, first and foremost, right? I think we already have a regional war. It's just kind of low level. Like, obviously, there's like genocide in Gaza right now. The primary, like most of the vast majority of the violence taking place right now is in Gaza. But you can't separate that from what's happening in the rest of the region, because essentially what you have in this region now, which you didn't have 20 years ago, is what's called the resistance axis. And when we talk about the resistance axis, what we mean is the collection of groups across the region that exist to fight the US, to fight Israel, to basically defend their countries. That's why they exist. And let me break down what I mean by that. I mean, you have Iran, which is the country that's sort of like the leadership of the resistance axis because it's the source of arms and funding and training to some degree. You have a group like Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese political party that has a massive military wing that came into existence to fight Israel's occupation of Lebanon in the 80s, and still exists to protect the territorial integrity of Lebanon and to fight not just Israel, but they actually, fought ISIS in Syria, right? Because ISIS posed a threat to Lebanon. So they see themselves as fighting US imperialism, and that means fighting its proxies. But first and foremost, Israel, because Israel does pose an existential threat to Lebanon. And had it not been for Hezbollah, Israel would still occupy South Lebanon. So that's Lebanese Hezbollah. Then you have the Iraqi Hashd Shabi, or what's known in English as the Popular Mobilization Forces, which came into being after ISIS took over large swaths of Iraq. And a few of the factions in the PMF, which has now been actually absorbed into the Iraqi security forces, so they're actually a part of the Iraqi state, a few of the factions in it continue to have a ideology of resistance, and they're the ones who are hitting at the US bases in Iraq. They want the US to leave, but they also say that they're doing this in response to the genocide in Gaza. They're saying, end the genocide in Gaza and we'll stop hitting at the US, but until it ends, we're going to hit at US in the region where we can, and sometimes they've actually also been hitting Israel to pressure them to stop the genocide. And I also should mention about Hezbollah. Since October 8th, Hezbollah has been involved in a tit for tat firing back and forth between the Israelis and Hezbollah, mostly isolated to South Lebanon and northern Israel for since then, and that's also been scary because that's been kind of gradually escalating, and everyone's afraid that that will end up turning into a big war on Lebanon. Uh, and then you have the Yemenis, and the Yemenis I think surprised everybody because the Yemenis have been dealing with what you can be considered their own genocide. A Saudi-led war on Yemen took place for several years, and that was armed by the UK and the US to try to defeat Ansar Allah, known more familiarly by people in the West as the Houthis, who ultimately won that war and now control most of the country, and they basically control the government there. And since this genocide on Gaza started, they basically intervened by blocking any ships going through Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea that were destined for Israel. This was their way of exacting economic consequences on the Israelis to try to pressure them to end their genocide in Gaza. And of course, this is where the US and the UK joined forces to start bombing Yemen to try to to try to deter the Yemenis from blocking Israeli ships. I mean, the Yemenis have literally killed no one in blocking these ships. It could be classified 100%, I think, as a humanitarian intervention. They've even said themselves that this is their way of intervening because Israel's violated the Genocide Convention. And the US response to that and the British response to that has been to bomb the Yemenis. They killed, I think the US at one point sunk like 3 Yemeni ships and killed 5 people. And then they also killed, I think, 10 people in their last round of airstrikes on Yemen. So this is the regional war, right? It's like you have these various forces across the region saying we are doing this for no other reason other than to force you, to pressure you to end the genocide in Gaza. And instead of ending it, the US and the UK twiddle their thumbs and they cry and complain about how they're the victims. And the only way to stop all of these different forces is to bomb them, rather than listen to what they're actually saying. And so if there's a fear of a bigger war happening here, it's really in the hands of the US and the UK, because they're the ones, especially the US more so, they're the ones who can stop the genocide in Gaza. Until the genocide in Gaza stops, this is going to continue to escalate. So it's actually really risky to allow this to continue because the longer it goes on, the more these other forces in the region are going to keep firing and firing to put pressure on the Israelis and on the Americans to stop the genocide in Gaza. But they can only, escalate notch for notch and tit for tat for so long before there's like a trigger point that escalates into something that nobody else, nobody can control anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is essentially what you're talking about is the threat of a really major regional war. And as you've been saying, over the last few months, you've seen Israel repeatedly attacking Lebanon, repeatedly attacking Syria, and also constantly threatening Iran, as you referred to earlier in the podcast, seeing as that the main enemy in the Middle East. But the United States, with its sort of PR department, is publicly stating that they're against widening the war beyond Gaza. And obviously, as you've just mentioned, their actions really actually suggest quite the opposite. And it looks like they're pushing towards a major regional war in the Middle East. So given, just like zooming out a little bit, given the catastrophic consequences of the so-called war on terror and the humiliating defeat US imperialism suffered after 20 years of war, what do you think the rationale is for US foreign policy in the region today? Like, why is it going down this path towards what could become a really major regional war?
That's a really good question. And I think in large part it's because they're stuck. I think it's because Israel's stuck. Israel laid out military objectives in Gaza that it cannot achieve. It said that what it needs in Gaza is to defeat Hamas. It can't defeat Hamas. I think it's been demonstrated. I mean, after almost 4 months of like leveling all of northern Gaza, including hospitals, Hamas is still capable of firing from northern Gaza. So it's even if they were to kill everyone in Gaza, which let's hope they don't, but let's say they did, Hamas still exists outside of Gaza. Like, resistance to Israel will always exist, and this group will always exist. The only way to make it not exist anymore is to get rid of this settler colonial ideology that is foundational to Israel's existence right now. But because they laid out these objectives they can't reach, they're stuck, because if they leave Gaza and Hamas is still there, even 3 Hamas fighters are still there, they lose. Hamas wins. I mean, I don't, when I say win, I should qualify that with like literally just surviving at this point for Hamas is winning. Uh, and this is kind of what you could say the U.S. did in Afghanistan, right? Like the U.S. was in Afghanistan for like 20 years, didn't achieve any of its military objectives, and ended up leaving, and the Taliban's in charge now. Like this is like an ongoing pattern. So it's like, why do this if you're going to end up leaving or if you're going to end up being humiliated and defeated? Because they're stuck. Like the US was stuck in Afghanistan and Israel is stuck in Gaza. The difference though is like Afghanistan isn't a country the US is trying to colonize necessarily or like, take over the land so they can move their settlers into it. Whereas for Israel, it's like an existential crisis at this point. Israel's entire existence as the most powerful military in the region is like now dependent on having some sort of win in Gaza, right? Because if Israel can't even defeat Hamas in Gaza, what use is Israel to anyone in the global imperialist north? So Israel is stuck. And this is where you see some tension between the Americans and the Israelis. But the Americans aren't willing to use any leverage because they'll let Israel go all the way in Gaza. Like I don't think there are any red lines. I was a little bit surprised too. I didn't think it would go this far, but at this point, I think it's become clear there are no red lines in Gaza. Because the US knows that Israel does need to like come out with some sort of win. But interestingly enough, and here's where you see some contradictions between the US and Israel, the Americans don't want this to escalate into a war on Lebanon. But it's not because they love Lebanon. It's not because they're like, oh no, we don't want Israel to destroy. We don't want Israel to destroy Lebanon because people in Lebanon are like human or something, unlike the people in Gaza. It's because, and you have to read what the Americans say, it's because they're afraid Israel can't win in Lebanon. Because if Israel can't even beat Hamas in Gaza, which is operating in a death camp at this point, it's like Hamas is operating under the most difficult conditions imaginable to any military force. And Israel still can't defeat them. How on earth is Israel supposed to take on Hezbollah? Hezbollah is like far larger than Hamas. It's like 100,000 plus strong, right? People ready to fight and die for their land. And they're hardened fighters. They just spent years, fighting this war in Syria. Alongside, I might add, like some conventional military forces like the Russians. So they got a lot of experience there, not just doing defensive maneuvers, but also offensive maneuvers. So Hezbollah is like a totally different ball game for Israel. And also they're not operating out of a death camp. They're operating in a country where they have lots of depth and lots of space. And where the Israelis back in 2006 were incapable of invading a single village. Like they tried to invade Lebanon and failed, and it was humiliating for them. They have all the most superior air power in the world, but to actually do a ground invasion requires some skill that the Israelis just don't have, and they're also not on their terrain. So this is where you see the contradiction, because Israel right now wants, it seems, at least part of the Israeli government wants to escalate in Lebanon to try to force the Americans to get involved against Iran. The Americans, at least under Biden, like this could very well change under Trump, at least under Biden, the Americans don't want a war in Lebanon because one, they worry actually it would destroy Israel. And two, they also worry it would force them to get involved, and then it would force some sort of bigger war with Iran. So it is a big contradiction. It really is a huge contradiction. But I think this is also the kind of stupidity that you see among an extremely arrogant empire that feels entitled and superior, even though it hasn't won a war. I mean, when's the last time the US won a war? It loses everywhere it goes in so many ways. We could do a whole hours long podcast just on how the US has lost one war after another over the last several decades. So I think this is like an empire that's stuck and that isn't sure which way to go, and that's also belligerent and extremely violent and is willing to okay, if we go down, we take everyone down with us. And I think that's what's scary about the US right now.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think of it that way in the region that you're talking about. And yet it's acknowledged that China is really considered the United States' greatest challenge. I mean, how they're gonna deal with China when they can't deal with I don't know, but how does this fit in? I mean, what is the analysis? How does it fit into the context of China and the rest of the world?
Let me tell you a story. The one of the former president of Lebanon, somebody who worked in his office, told me uh that he was there like a few years ago. So let's say like the early 20, like let's say like late 19s or late teens, early 2020s, right? Of when I'm talking about years here. And this is in Lebanon, right? It's a really tiny country on the Mediterranean, doesn't have that many resources. Lebanon's really just important because Hezbollah exists there, and like America hates Hezbollah, and so does Israel. Um, but the point is, Lebanon has been experiencing this economic collapse. It's been in crisis. And China has tried to come and propose things to build in Lebanon. And every time a Chinese official would come and speak to the president's office and offer, hey, let's like do this project. We could build this. We could help with this power station. The next day, they would get a call from the American ambassador saying, I want a meeting, like making some reason for having a meeting and then coming in and threatening, if you guys do something with China, we'll sanction you. And I mean, this shouldn't surprise us, right? Like we know the US does this. But ultimately, we know also if you read past like decade of what the US, maybe longer, of what the US says in its like national security papers from the Pentagon, of what its like entire, rationale for how it operates in the world is, China's first and foremost. It's all about, pivot to Asia. It's all about great power competition. It's all about making sure China's economy doesn't eclipse America's economy, making sure China doesn't have better technology. And it's all about China, 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 right? And sometimes there's some Russia, but mostly China. And if it's about Russia, it's also in the context of China. So that is what the US is most concerned about. So when we talk about what U.S. interests are in the Middle East, we also have to remember that the Middle East is actually West Asia, right? It's a part of Asia. It's on the like you can like land, you can go by land, right? Like through all of this continent of Asia. And so the U.S. wants to make sure that the Middle East stays subservient to the West. And to do that, you have to keep it cut off from China. And so that's a big part of this too. I mean, this is why, things like the Belt and Road Initiative, when it comes to the Middle East, the US is always trying to come up with alternatives. When it comes to BRICS, right? With Saudi Arabia joining BRICS, the US like immediately tried to create some alternative to that between like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Like it's like the US is trying to keep the Middle East in the Western, in the European, in the US orbit, despite the fact that actually naturally it should have more economic ties to China. And so I think that's where, that plays into here as well, is, the US maintaining hegemony over these regions that are close to China. And that actually has become a part of like its imposition on the region. But there's been a lot of pushback against that too. Like you have countries that have historically been client states of the US that are now, they're not becoming adversaries of the US, but they're trying to play a game where they can both be friends with the US, but also have a really strong relationship with China because they recognize that China is actually the economic future, especially for their region. I mean, here I'm talking about a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, or like the UAE, the Emirates, or even like Egypt. I mean, these countries all have huge trading relationships with China, and they're not willing to put that on hold or sacrifice that just to please the US. And that's really, really concerning for the US. So part of like, a part of, I don't know, when you want to put the Gaza, I don't know if you can quite put the Gaza in the context of like great power competition with China, but part of the genocide in Gaza is to maintain this Israeli project as like America's police in the region, because you have to control this region, and controlling this region has become even more important with the economic rise of China.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Rania. That's a really, really interesting to think about the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think quite recently I saw in the news that China's involved in building 1,000 schools in Iraq, which is definitely not something that the United States did. I think they more like destroyed, thousands of schools and much else of the country. And I think, the idea that we have, China's the enemy, they're just as evil as US imperialism. I mean, just that fact alone should just shatter that for everyone, really.
Yeah.
we've got our work cut out on sort of, building greater awareness about what's going on in the world. And one thing we like to ask everyone who comes on the show is, what would you recommend for people to read, listen to, or watch in order to develop a more full understanding of what's happening in the world today? It's obviously a really fast-moving, changing situation. So what would you recommend to inform and inspire the anti-war movement?
Well, I think programs like yours are so important. The work No Cold War does, I've always been a big fan, on all social media platforms, by the way. And I would also say, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff coming out of the Tricontinental Institute when it comes to this stuff. Especially if people are interested in learning more about China in English, Dongsheng News is really good. My friend Ting Chak does a lot over there. And you just kind of get like regular updates about what's happening in China that isn't clouded by all this insanity. Like if you open the New York Times, anything about China is always like something evil China did. Be afraid of China. It's just constantly fear mongering about China. So I encourage people to check that out. I mean, not to toot my own horn, not necessarily just me, but I think the work we've been doing at Breakthrough News, I love being a part of Breakthrough News, because the work everybody does there, I think, is super helpful and informative on so many different levels. One thing I really love about the outlet I get to work at is that we do center voices from the global South. I think a lot more than a lot of other places, especially on like the left, the left media sphere in the US. And activist voices, academic voices, political voices, and particularly with Africa. I mean, when there was all these coups in West Africa and they were kicking out the French, I think when it came to English language coverage and just interviews, I think we had probably the most of them at Breakthrough News, like regular weekly, on my show Dispatches, also on our Freedom Side live stream. If you follow us on Instagram. So I genuinely encourage people to check it out. I think I really like, I feel so privileged to be a part of offering that resource to people. Also, People's Dispatch is really good if you like to read. Like written reports, covering just people's movements all around the world with a particular focus on the global South. So good on Latin America, so good on India, all across Asia, I would say, and Africa as well, Middle East as well. I mean, everywhere. It's so incredible the work they do there. I really like NewsClick. There's so many outlets to follow in English, and those are ones I would start with as like sort of at least, a gateway into all of that. But you mentioned something that I just kind of want to add something to before you asked this question, and that was about like what China building schools in Iraq versus what the US has done in Iraq. And it's funny, I saw this Voice of America report, and Voice of America is funded by the US government. And it was this video report where they were talking about the schools that China built in Iraq, and there was this like really scary music they were playing. And it was so crazy. They were trying to frame the building of schools as something like really nefarious. Like this is, and they interviewed this one Iraqi guy on the street, and they were like, this Iraqi man is really concerned. And then like he spoke and he didn't actually express any concern. He just said that they were doing, which was building a school. But there was like bad music in the background. And it's so funny because when you actually go to places, like I've been to Iraq a bunch of times. I mean, people aren't walking around waving a Chinese flag, but they definitely don't see China as some big bully, because China hasn't done anything to bully them. And the same goes for a country like Lebanon. The same goes for a lot of the countries, at least I've been to in Africa. And it just has more to do with the fact that China not only builds things, but it doesn't have this like coercive transactional relationship where like, if we build this for you, you have to like get rid of all your public subsidies for something, or like you have to give us everything, or like the US, they don't even offer to build anything. They're just like, hey, if you do what we want, we won't bomb you. Like, like they don't even offer to build. The only people I've ever heard repeat like these talking points about China being like big, bad, and scary are people who work for Western funded NGOs in these countries. And that's it. Or people who like are like just like really like culturally into like America and Europe and like want to leave and go move there. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's a little bit funny the way it gets portrayed in the West.
No, fantastic. And thanks for tooting your horn, because if you didn't, we would have to, but we're going to do it anyway. Definitely like and subscribe, not just Breakthrough News, but do follow Rania on social media if you're not already, because it's just really brilliant to hear a fresh perspective, from an American Lebanese journalist like yourself. It's really valuable. Thanks so much for everything that you do. Ileana,
Thank you
over
so
to
much for
you.
having me.
Thank you much. Thank you so much for being on our show. It was an absolute delight for me personally. Yeah, I love the freedom side. So thank you. And to everyone watching, please like and subscribe and follow us on socials. See you next time. Bye.